Welcome back to Teach Me in 10. Today's guest is Dr. Hannah Holmes, a licensed psychologist, professor, and consultant at the Appalachian State University, where she specializes in health psychology, anxiety, chronic pain, and women's health. Now, today, Holmes is going to talk about the vagus nerve and how it could be used in medicine. To start us off, what exactly is the vagus nerve and why is it so important?
The vagus nerve is a very long nerve that travels from the brainstem all the way down to the colon. And the term vagus is actually a word that derives from the Latin term for wandering, which makes sense because it literally wanders through a large part of your body. And it's so important because it's basically the way that our brain and our body connects, one of the ways that our brain and body connects. It sends information from the brain to a variety of different organs and vice versa. So it also allows for our body and specific organs in the body to communicate with the brain. So it helps regulate essential involuntary functions like breathing, heart rate, digestion, and so forth.
Now, what parts of the body does the vagus nerve connect to, and what kinds of functions does it control?
So the vagus nerve, like I mentioned before, is mostly sensory, meaning that about 80% of its fibers are communicating information from the body to the brain. Motor fibers make up about 20% of the vagus nerve, and those are communicating from the brain to the body. So the main functions controlled by the vagus nerve are anything having to do with the parasympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic regulation. So it slows heart rate, lowers your blood pressure, stimulates digestion, and regulates breathing. It's important for even just understand. So different systems in your body, like your GI system, communicates or provides sensory feedback to your brain via the vagus nerve. This is called interoception. It's how we basically can understand or detect what we're feeling inside our body. So it's also involved in motor control, controls muscles used for things like swallowing and speaking. And it's also involved in immune modulation. So it helps to regulate inflammation and immune responses. And then finally, it is involved in mood and stress regulation. It influences emotional processing, for example, via the gut-brain axis, which is a term maybe you've heard of before, referring to the way that our brain and our guts, intestines and stomach and so forth communicate with each other. So the specific organs and body regions that are connected by the vagus nerve, include the neck. So it starts in the brain, of course, travels through the neck. If you've ever seen a device that is used to stimulate the vagus nerve, that's usually used up here on the neck where the vagus nerve is found. So it travels through the neck, through the pharynx and the larynx. And that's how it's involved in things like swallowing, speaking. And then it moves down through the chest or the thorax. And that's how it's communicating with the heart and the lungs. And it regulates things like heart rate and breathing that way. And then finally, it goes all the way down to the abdomen, through the esophagus, stomach, liver, small intestine, and so forth. And this is how it helps to regulate digestion, gut motility, and how it communicates the status of the gut to the brain.
How does the vagus nerve relate to the autonomic nervous system and the idea of rest and digest?
There are two different branches in the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, as you may know, is the system responsible for activating your fight or flight response. This helps you stay safe in the face of threats or danger. It does things like increase your heart rate, slow down short-term unnecessary processes like digestion, so that you can put all your resources toward either fighting if needed or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, helps to calm your body and return to its baseline state so that you can do things like rest and digest food. This helps the body relax, recover, and just maintain internal balance or homeostasis after stress. So the vagus nerve is responsible for a lot of the rest and digest functions. So things like slowing your heart rate, reducing cardiac output, stimulating gut motility and secretion to allow for digestion, lowering blood pressure, going along with heart rate, and just supporting calm, social engagement, and emotional balance. So, if you've heard the term vagal tone before, that's referencing the ability of the vagus nerve to perform this parasympathetic function, or in other words, the ability of the vagus nerve to activate and produce these things like the reduced heart rate and increased gut motility. When people talk about vagal tone, they're referencing that dynamic, being able to return to baseline after stress and also being able to have an appropriate stress response in the face of a threat. So some of the ways we measure that would be things such as heart rate variability, which is your heart's ability to vary its rate per your external requirements, right? So if you want to be able to run, your heart rate needs to be able to go up. But then ideally, a healthy heart, which is reflective of a healthy vagal tone, would be able to bring you back down to a calm heart rate relatively quickly. That's what heart rate variability would mean.
How does the vagus nerve affect mental health or emotional regulation?
So the vagus nerve is involved. It plays a crucial role in mental health and emotion regulation. So anytime that you're calm or you're doing something to calm your body, your vagus nerve is involved. So your ability, when you take some deep breaths, some deep, calming, mindful breaths, you are stimulating or activating your vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, and I mentioned vagal tone, that ability to flexibly move between a highly aroused sympathetic nervous system state and a more calm parasympathetic state is related to things like chronic stress. So we know that when a person undergoes ongoing chronic stress, sometimes without getting too into the weeds, your body's stress response system can get a little haywire where you're not really fully returning, or it takes a long time for you to return to that baseline parasympathetic state. So for a person who maybe isn't having a hard time relaxing or calming, what's happening is their vagus nerve and their kind of body's stress response system in general isn't maybe operating as quickly or as fully as would be beneficial. And then I would add to that too, that if you think about certain anxiety, sometimes when you're feeling anxious, you can feel it in your gut, right? Like butterflies in your stomach. So some of the ways where we experience emotions in the body, the vagus nerve is involved in some of that. So your body is, or the vagus nerve is interpreting signals or sending signals from our body to our brain, affecting emotional states by modulating activity in key areas of the brain, like the amygdala, which is involved in fear processing, and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in in emotional processing and interpreting situations.
What is vagus nerve stimulation therapy, and how is it used in medicine today?
Vagus nerve stimulation therapy, sometimes it's called VNS therapy. It's basically just stimulating via electrical impulses the vagus nerve. And there's a lot of talk about this in recent years, especially over the last couple of years. Especially, you'll often see tips on social media for stimulating your vagus nerve or resetting your vagus nerve. And a true VNS device is either going to be implanted, and that's often used for, there's two ways that that's FDA approved, and that's for drug-resistant epilepsy and treatment-resistant depression. And then there's also external non-invasive devices, or VNS, vagus nerve stimulators, things like Truvago, that you place on the skin where the vagus nerve runs. And those are purported to help with things like stress and fatigue and various physical maladies. So again, those are FDA approved for drug-resistant epilepsy and treatment-resistant depression. But there's also a lot of investigations into other ways it might be helpful. So things like rehab from stroke, chronic migraines and cluster headaches, inflammatory disorders, since we know the vagus nerve is involved in the inflammatory processes in the body, and cardiovascular conditions. So there's a lot of interesting research happening and a lot of ways that VNS might help with more conditions in the future. But yes, if you've heard of any of the at-home vagus nerve stimulation techniques, so things like long, deep breaths, even humming is involved. The vagus nerve can be stimulated with that probably because it runs through your vocal cords might vibrate it. And those can be helpful for feeling more calm. And I would just note that conversely, anything you do to produce calm and induce relaxation is going to affect the vagus nerve. So two-way street. So you don't necessarily need to directly, literally stimulate the vagus nerve to get some of those benefits. You can also just do things that relax your body, and that will induce the same kind of parasympathetic nervous system response.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.